Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. In this episode, Diep makes the bold choice to adopt little Nye, even without James's knowledge. Through working in the fields, selling at the market, and sharing simple moments at home, the two slowly build a true bond of mother and daughter. Despite village gossip and hardship, Diep's love never wavers. When Nye falls ill and calls her mama for the first time, that bond becomes unbreakable. But with James soon returning, Diep must face his reaction and decide how to protect the family she has chosen. Stay with us until the end to see how this life-changing decision shapes her future. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 followers. Your support means so much. Diep sat quietly in her modest home, the thin walls echoing the sound of the rain outside. A single bulb swung gently overhead, casting shifting shadows across the room. The silence pressed down on her until she heard the soft footsteps of Nye, the little girl who had been living with her for only a short while. Diep hadn't told James about her decision. She hadn't asked for his opinion, hadn't waited for his return. She simply couldn't. When she found Nye, frightened and abandoned, something inside her had broken open. A space she didn't even know she had was suddenly filled with the need to protect, to nurture, to give this child what no one had given her when she was young, a sense of belonging. The memory of her argument with her younger relative still haunted her. The harsh words, the slammed door, the emptiness that followed. She had tried so hard to keep the family together, but that night she realized that family isn't only blood. Sometimes, family is the one you choose. And so, in a moment of quiet conviction, she chose Nye. That morning, Diep was already at work in the fields, her hands brushing away dew as she harvested vegetables. The pumpkins had grown fat and round, their orange skins glowing beneath the cloudy sky. Nye trailed behind her, curious but obedient, her small hands occasionally reaching out to touch the rough leaves. Diep glanced over her shoulder and said gently, "Stay close, Nye. These vines can trip you, and if it rains, you mustn't run off." The girl nodded, her eyes wide. "I'll wait for you. I won't go anywhere." The promise gave Diep a fragile sense of peace. She bent to gather more pumpkins, her muscles straining as the basket filled. She worked faster, worried about the gathering storm overhead. Then came the first distant rumble of thunder. "Nye!" Diep called, her voice quick with worry. "Come here. It's going to rain." The girl ran toward her, small arms full of 2 pumpkins she'd tried to carry herself. Her face lit up with pride. "Look, I helped too." Diep's heart ached with both love and fear. "They're too heavy for you," she scolded softly, taking them from her. But then she added, "Thank you. You did well." By the time they made it back to the path, rain was pouring down. Diep pulled the basket up onto her shoulder with one hand and clutched Nye's arm with the other, guiding her carefully along the slippery ground. The girl tried to shield Diep with a worn umbrella, its ribs bent from age. The sight made Diep laugh despite the struggle. "Be careful with that old thing, little one. It's hardly doing the job." When they finally reached home, both were drenched but smiling. Diep dried Nye with a towel, then sat beside her to share a simple meal. As they ate, Diep found herself watching the girl, Her small bites, her shy smile, the way she leaned close when speaking. Something inside her whispered, "This is what it feels like to be a mother." The next day, Diep decided they would take the pumpkins to the market. "If we sell enough," she told Nye, "we can buy you some new clothes, maybe even a pair of shoes." Nye's face brightened. "Really? Shoes just for me?" Diep ruffled her hair. "Of course, every child deserves their own pair." At the market, the air was filled with noise. Vendors calling out, the smell of grilled food rising, and customers bargaining for better deals. Diep set down her basket and began her calls, her voice mixing with the crowd. "Fresh pumpkins, only 5,000 each. Come support me." At first, people passed by with little notice, but soon a kind man stopped, examining the produce. "How much for two?" he asked. 10,000, uncle," Diep replied, forcing a hopeful smile. He nodded, pulling bills from his pocket. "They look good. I'll take them." Nee clapped her hands, delighted by the first sale. Encouraged, Diep kept calling. Slowly, more customers came, an auntie buying 4, a neighbor buying 3. Each time, Diep thanked them sincerely, bowing her head, while Nye eagerly handed over the pumpkins. The little girl's laughter drew more people, her innocence softening even the hardest faces. Coins clinked into Diep's hand, small but precious. She looked at Nee and whispered, "We're doing it. You and me. We'll make it." Hours passed until the basket was finally empty. Diep felt her back ache, but her spirit was light. She hugged Nye tightly, the child's damp hair pressed against her cheek. "We sold them all," she murmured, almost in disbelief. "Soon we'll buy your new clothes." Together, they walked through puddles back home, sharing an umbrella that barely covered them both. The rain had eased into a mist, soft against their skin. In that quiet, Diep felt something she hadn't in years hoped. That evening, when the house grew still, Diep picked up the phone and dialed James. She hesitated before he answered, unsure how much to tell him. "Diep," his voice came, warm and tired. "How are you? How's the house?" "The house is fine," she said softly. "The workers did well. It feels stronger now. And I'm not alone anymore." There was a pause on the line. "What do you mean?" Diep swallowed. "I've been caring for a little girl. Her name is Nee. I didn't wait for you, James. I just knew I had to keep her with me. She has no one else." James sighed, but there was no anger in his tone. "You've always had a soft heart, Diep. If you feel this is right, then we'll face it together when I return." His words steadied her. She smiled into the receiver. "Thank you. Today we went to the market, sold all the pumpkins. Nye helped. She was so proud." James chuckled quietly. "I can almost see it. You calling out with your strong voice, and a little girl by your side. Diep, just take care of yourself too. Don't forget to eat." "I won't," she promised. "And I'll take care of her, no matter what." After they hung up, Diep turned to Nye, who had already dozed off on the mat. She tucked a thin blanket over her small body and whispered, "Sleep well, my child. Tomorrow we'll do it all again." The night was still, except for the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Diep sat quietly, her thoughts circling. She had chosen this path, chosen this child, without hesitation. And though the challenges ahead were many, she felt no regret. For the first time in years, her house did not feel empty. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, hard work, small joys, and the quiet companionship between Diep and Nai. Yet beneath the routine, Diep felt the weight of her decision. She knew James would return eventually, and she didn't know how he would feel seeing a child suddenly part of their home. But every time Ni's small hand reached for hers, Diep told herself she had done the right thing. One morning, Diep rose early, tying her hair back before stepping into the yard. The air was cool, mist curling around the pumpkins and cassava plants. Ni trailed behind her, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Come on," Diep said gently, handing her a small woven basket. "We'll gather beans today, lighter than pumpkins. You can help me carry them." Ni grinned, eager to join in. Together, they moved through the rows, collecting handfuls of beans. Nai's laughter rang out whenever she dropped one, chasing it across the soil like a marble. Diep watched her with a bittersweet smile, reminded of the childhood she herself had never truly known. As they worked, a neighbor stopped by, an older woman carrying a bundle of firewood. "Diep, I see you've taken in a child," she remarked, eyes sharp with curiosity. Diep straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Yes, this is Nai. She's been with me a little while." The woman tilted her head. "And James? Did he agree to this?" Diep hesitated. "He doesn't know yet, but he will understand. He always does." The neighbor frowned, but said nothing more. Walking off with her bundle, Diep exhaled, forcing away the unease. She wouldn't let gossip or doubt shake her resolve. By midday, they had enough beans to sell. Diep and Ni carried their baskets to the village market again, weaving through the bustle of vendors and buyers. Their stall was modest, a cloth laid on the ground, with beans neatly arranged in piles. Diep raised her voice. "Fresh beans, just picked this morning. Come and see." Ni mimicked her, calling in her high-pitched voice, "Beans, beans, very fresh." The crowd chuckled at her enthusiasm, and soon people began to buy. A man leaned down to Nai, handing her coins. "You're a good helper. Your mother must be proud." The word "mother" caught Diep off guard. For a heartbeat, she wanted to correct him, to explain that she wasn't truly Nai's mother. But then she saw the way Ni beamed, clutching the coins as if they were treasure. The child believed it. She believed Diep was her mother now. And in that moment, Diep realized she wanted to be. When the beans were sold out, they used the earnings to buy rice, oil, and a small treat for Nai, a sweet bun filled with red bean paste. Nai held it like it was gold, nibbling carefully so it would last. That evening, as the sky turned crimson, Diep sat with Ni on the porch. "Did you like the bun?" she asked. Ni nodded, crumbs clinging to her lips. "It was the best thing ever. Thank you, Mama." The word startled Diep, but it filled her with warmth. She placed an arm around the girl's shoulders and whispered, "You're welcome, my child." Still, as the days turned into weeks, challenges grew. Some villagers murmured about Diep taking in a child without her husband's consent. Others questioned how she would manage with the extra burden. Supplies ran short, and the fields demanded constant attention. Yet through every hardship, Nee was by her side, helping, laughing, reminding Diep why she had made this choice. One night, after putting Nai to bed, Diep sat by the phone again. She hesitated, then dialed James. "Hello," his tired voice answered. "It's me," Diep said softly. "How is your work?" "Busy, as always," he replied. "But tell me about you. How are things with the child?" Diep hesitated. "It's not easy. The villagers talk. Some say I shouldn't have done this without you." James was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Diep, you've always acted with your heart. That's why I love you. When I come back, we'll figure it out, together." Tears pricked her eyes. "Thank you, James. I just want her to feel safe, to feel loved." "You're already giving her that," he said. "Don't doubt yourself." The call ended, but his words lingered. They steadied her when doubt crept in. One afternoon, Nee fell ill. She lay on the mat, face pale, forehead hot. Panic gripped Diep as she pressed a hand to the child's skin. Memories of losing her own parents flooded back, and she vowed she wouldn't lose this child too. She rushed to prepare herbal medicine, cooling cloths, and whispered reassurances. All night, Diep sat by Nai's side, wiping sweat from her brow, humming lullabies she barely remembered. At dawn, the fever broke, and Nee stirred, whispering, "Mama, I'm thirsty." Diep's relief was overwhelming. She held the girl close, whispering, "I'm here. I'll always be here." That scare deepened Diep's bond with Nai. She realized she wasn't just caring for the girl out of pity or duty. She had become her mother in every way that mattered. Weeks passed, and James finally called again with news. "Diep, the house is nearly finished. Soon, I'll be home." Her heart leapt with both joy and dread. She longed for his presence, but she also feared his reaction to finding Nee firmly rooted in their lives. That evening, she prepared a simple dinner: rice, vegetables, and a bit of salted fish. Nee sat across from her, swinging her legs happily. "Are you excited to meet Uncle James?" Diep asked gently. Nee looked puzzled. "Will he like me?" Diep reached across the table, taking her hand. "How could he not? You're kind, brave, and you've brought so much happiness into our home. He will see that." The child smiled shyly, reassured. When night fell, Diep tucked Nai into bed, then sat outside beneath the stars. She thought of James's return, of the conversations they would have, of the future that lay ahead. She knew there would be struggles, compromises, and perhaps even anger. But she also knew one thing with certainty: she would not give up Nai. Diep whispered to the night, as if speaking to James across the distance, "This is our daughter now. I hope you can accept her as I have." The crickets sang. The moon hung low, and the quiet farm seemed to hold its breath with her. In the days that followed, Diep prepared both the home and her heart. She fixed up the small room beside hers, laying down clean mats and arranging little trinkets Nee loved. Smooth stones, bright flowers, scraps of colored cloth. She wanted James to see not just a child, but a life already woven into theirs. And though uncertainty loomed, Diep felt stronger than ever. She had faced storms, hunger, gossip, and loneliness. Yet here she was, no longer alone, no longer empty. As dawn broke over the fields, she carried Nee on her hip, pointing toward the horizon where the sun rose golden. Look, child, that's where tomorrow comes from, and tomorrow will always come, as long as we keep walking forward. Nee leaned her head on Diep's shoulder, whispering, "As long as I have you, Mama." Diep closed her eyes, holding her tight, knowing that no matter what awaited when James returned, this bond could never be undone.